Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
We were all quite chuffed with how our episode on free jazz went, and it gave us the courage to tackle another challenging topic we've always wanted to get to, classical music. Now, our main focus today is going to be how to quote-unquote get into classical music, but we're going to approach that question by focusing on one specific piece, maybe the most famous piece in all of classical music, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the bum one. And we're going to narrow things even more by focusing on two legendary but very different interpretations of the Fifth Symphony. Carlos Kleiber's 1974 performance with the Vienna Philharmonic recorded for Deutsche Grammophon, I'm not going to pronounce anything correct in this episode, and John Elliott Gardner's 1994 performance with the Orchestra Revolutionnaire et Romantique, again for DG. Before we dive in, I want to know your guys' previous experiences with classical music in general. Dan, I suspect you've spent the least time in that whole world, but is it something you enjoy at all?
Not really. It's sort of, people who listen to this podcast know that this is sort of the antithesis of the kind of stuff I like,
Why? Why do you say that?
Very stuffy, a lot of rules that you got to follow, all that. I do like 20th century composition, Steve Reich, John Cage, that kind of stuff. Does that count as classical music?
I guess so.
Yeah. Not a lot of guitar. I mean, that's worth mentioning, right?
That's true. There you go. Yeah, that is true.
Okay. I mean, you've obviously listened to the Fifth Symphony before.
Oh yeah.
Have you done it front to back and that kind of a thing?
Yeah. I mean, I've listened to Beethoven, Mozart, the greatest hits. I'm familiar with all those.
Okay. And what about you, Darren?
For me, classical music sort of came, or at least, when I really got into actually listening to classical music. I mean, I think classical music's kind of always been a part of my life in some way, shape, or form. But it wasn't until I want to say kind of like college when I really was actually checking into the works of Beethoven, getting into different recordings, actually listening, kind of the way you were just putting it front to back. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Beethoven was really the first for me, and I don't know particularly what it was, but I was taking a lot of humanities courses, so you just kind of start learning about these different periods of time, 18th century, 19th century stuff, and you really no college course really can talk about those centuries without at least touching on what's happening in the world of music. And lo and behold, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, all that stuff is going on at the same time with all these other movements that you're learning about in these classes. So I just got very interested in that. And, boy, it was just kind of as soon as I jumped in, it was just a whole new universe of music that I had never really even considered or explored. What about you, Gabe?
Yeah, I went through a period where I listened to just classical music. And this is just something I do. It's a weird quirk of mine. I've probably mentioned it on previous episodes, but it's I like to have a project, and when I just don't get something, I try to force myself to understand what the big deal is. So, this was back in the iPod Classic days, and I just deleted everything off of it except for classical music to force myself to only listen to classical for months and months and months and try to get it, So that was where I kind of figured out, I think, how to get into classical music, which is our big topic here. But I've certainly spent a lot of time with classical music in general, especially this symphony. I do want to emphasize, though, before we get any hate mail or whatever, that we are coming at this as non-experts. You would agree, right, Darren?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You probably won't be hearing much musical theory, and if you do, we're probably wrong.
Yes. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that humility, because I think the idea here is that we are approaching it as sort of outsiders, and I think that's who we're talking to. People who are interested, like we once were, in kind of getting into classical music, who come from that. This other realm of pop, rock, electronic, that kind of stuff. So on that note, Darren, what is the best way to, listen to classical music?
Well, I think it's important to obviously go with what you probably are at least somewhat familiar with, and I think that's part of the reason why we have chosen the Fifth Symphony. Whether you are into classical or not, surely you have heard bum 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 bum, somewhere, right. Even if somebody was going bum bum bum, even things like that, you know what I mean? You're at least somewhat familiar with it, and I think that the great thing about this symphony in particular is it starts off with something. It starts off with that, so you're like, okay, I got it. I at least understand this portion of the music. But I think that. And this goes for like pretty much any piece of music that's super long, because most classical pieces are, on average, probably a little bit longer or as long as an entire, CD of regular music, right? 40 minutes, 50 minutes. Some actually go, hours long. But I think it requires, a little bit of focused attention, right? If you truly do want to try to get into it, I think that, it's a great headphone listening experience, I feel like, because especially if you get your hands on a great recording, trying to listen to all the different instruments. Like, I think recordings are incredibly important. We'll kind of get into that. But as far as like, what is the best way to like listen to it? I would say just start with something super simple, but, I like your sort of approach, Gabe, of like trying to focus yourself on it and not try to jump to too many different things or even allow yourself to, get distracted with other types of music. Like really just drill into like one piece of music.
Yes. And I want to emphasize that seriously, because I sort of was making this mistake early on when I was first trying. It's like, you'll have this temptation, especially now we live in the streaming age. You don't have to load shit onto your iPod Classic. Yeah. You'll have this temptation to like, get into Beethoven, as a whole. And you're just like doing yourself a disservice. Like pick one symphony and listen to a bunch of recordings of that symphony, because we'll get into this, but you hear like different colors, different emphasis, different interpretive choices, and you start to like get inside the thing a lot more, but you just gotta resist, like all week, right? We chose the Fifth Symphony, and Carlos Kleiber, for example, the CD goes from the Fifth Symphony to the Seventh Symphony, and it's like Seventh Symphony starts. I'm really tempted to like just keep on listening because it's really wonderful. Right. But, for the purposes of this project, putting myself in the headspace of somebody kind of trying to get into it, stay focused on that Fifth Symphony. Dan, after this like 2 weeks of us forcing you to listen to one classical piece over and over again, what do you think is the best way to sit down and listen to classical music?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what you said, like don't be tempted to just go to the next one, because like what I did to avoid that was like I just made a playlist of like the first the first half, so that I wouldn't just if I was just reading or sort of not being like attentive, you didn't want to catch what was the end. So I think that was like a good thing to do, although I guess a little counterintuitive since they package it together or whatever. But I do think really with almost anything, it's nice to focus. If you can take something big and break it down into smaller parts, it's always easier to digest.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, kind of going to what you were saying, Gabe, about there's just so much. Like, not only do composers like Beethoven, Mozart have like a large body of work, between piano sonatas, concertos, all of symphonies, all the different things. There's like 1,000 recordings of each of these pieces of work. Like, it's truly, overwhelming if you like take one look at, a discography or something.
Not only like overwhelming, but like in our like digital age and everything, like I think it's sort of coming around now, but I remember when I was like younger and I would listen to some, classical, like getting into it a little bit or whatnot. It's like very annoying to like tag and like look up, even like I was trying to, like look up these specific recordings on like Rate Your Music and stuff. And it's like, you really have to like kind of dig to find the ones you're like actually trying to find. You can't just search Beethoven's Fifth. You're gonna get 8 billion results.
Gabe, I think I recall us having some extremely elitist and snobby arguments on the art of tagging classical music in iTunes. Yeah,
it was a massive obsession, and I would like change my mind about one little thing and go through my entire collection and change them all.
Oh, so the streaming age has really hurt that, though. I do want to say, like, it's
even now,
so
like these two that we picked, you save them to your phone, and it still lists the artist as like Beethoven, and then in like the orchestra, like the conductor is like the last thing, which doesn't fit when you just have it saved, in your albums. Yeah. Like I literally had to like look at the album cover, make the album cover bigger in Spotify, and like read the out, which I guess is like sort of the way it was intended originally, but it just sort of like doesn't meld well with the digital age.
Yeah, it's true, but I am happy that like streaming has taken it out of my hands. Like I can't.
That's true.
I just got to deal because I spend so much time in the tagging shit. One weird question that I kind of like couldn't come up with a good answer for, but found kind of interesting is like, what is different and what is similar to listening to like pop, rock, or any of the genres that like our demographic is more familiar with? You know what I mean? Like, are there any similarities? Or I think just completely different?
Like coming from the person who is least familiar with classical music, I think that the difference is that pop, you basically anyone listening to this was born in the world, the modern world, and so they're just the tropes and the instruments and the things that can consist of pop music are very familiar to us all. And then classical is using different instruments, it's using different sorts of arrangements and stuff, whereas like obviously what a violin sounds like, a flute and shit, but it's just not like as innate of a of an idea, I think, and also like Darren mentioned, like a lot of classical pieces can be 45 minutes, an hour, longer, whereas generally pop music and stuff is that 3.5 format.
Yeah, I mean, as far as similarities, I mean, I think there's a lot. I think a lot of the emotion that and the excitement that you get out of like pop music, is the same emotions that you can get from certain classical pieces. I mean, the Fifth Symphony, that's a banger. You know what I mean? Like you can turn that thing up on your headphones and, jam out the same way you would jam out to like, a great rock song. I mean, yeah, obviously there's a lot of difference in what it is you're actually listening to. But I mean, ultimately, to me, the enjoyment, the excitement, the thrill, like it's the same. Those feelings are still the same, even if the music is like wildly different.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because it does sort of work like pop music in the sense of like there are melodies and, there are sort of movements and different sections that you could compare to like verse, chorus, bridge, etc. But what's weird to me is that like classical music, it often works. It's like almost mostly melody, and sometimes the melodic passages are so long. You know what I mean? Like they just never stop for like an entire minute of just it's changing and going and going. It's not like a motif in a pop song is usually like 3 notes or 4 notes or something like that. Which we kind of do get here with like the bum 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 bum. But some of these lines are just flow and flow and flow, and yet they will kind of get stuck in your head if you spend enough time with them, like to where you're humming along the longest passage ever. Another thing that I thought was kind of odd is I think we live in a world where like the most classical music that most people hear is in the form of like film soundtrack.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think it has a tendency to like when you just hear this kind of instrumentation, strings and stuff, to like just kind of let it fade into the background because we are so used to it being background to a film scene or something. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of hard to focus because it feels like background music in a weird way.
Yeah, I mean that honestly is like my biggest struggle with it is it does just sort of sound like a movie, soundtrack to me. I mean, even I sort of thought like if this was just like if the Fifth Symphony was just like the soundtrack of a new movie that came out, like would we care as much? And it's sort of hard to differentiate it. I think just being born and raised in like this sort of being backgroundy type of thing.
Yeah, what do you think about that theory, Darren?
I mean, I agree. I do agree that like this sort of instrumentation, the orchestra, lends itself to that sort of background music. But I do think that there are some pieces that kind of grab at your attention. I really think, the Fifth is really just a great example of something that I feel like it's pretty easy to like for it to grab your attention and kind of keep your attention. If you're thinking of things like, maybe some of Mozart's earliest symphonies, or even Bach, or even further back, where it's just so, so much less like, I guess, drama and energy. That's the kind of example that I think a lot of people end up thinking about, or they sort of think all classical music is sort of like that, where it doesn't get very exciting. You know what I mean? I imagine the majority of people, if they're not into classical music, they've never heard like the fourth movement of the Fifth Symphony, where it's like just bombastic and, high octane energy, right? They just never get to that point.
Yeah. I just like find myself, or I remember finding myself like, I got really, really into Mahler, as a lot of people do. And, like he'll have like slow movements that are like 30 minutes long. And it just felt like a inherent thing in me as a modern person to just like drift away from it, and like forget that I'm listening to something, which I don't think was an issue in the 19th century. But on that note, let's move to the Fifth Symphony itself and talk about it like as a symphony as much as that is possible before we get to these specific performances. I want to ask you, Darren, about, since you're kind of the resident expert here. I'm just kidding. I want to remind everybody before they email, we're not experts. What kind of background, because there's obviously so much books have been written, like tons and tons of books probably about this symphony alone, maybe just the first movement, maybe just the first 8 notes. What kind of background is like necessary to know? And what kind of background information is just sort of fun to know? I'm thinking like historical, biographical stuff,
Yeah. So, during my sort of obsession with classical music, I have a couple of Beethoven books, did a lot of reading on the internet, largely because, Beethoven, just as trying to think of Beethoven as a person, I had such a hard time doing, because he was just he just seemed like a mythical character, you know what I mean? Like Beethoven, even as I was just getting into classical music, I knew the name Beethoven, but I didn't know anything really about his life. So like I was so fascinated by it. And I have to say, the way these books are written, obviously, so much of his life is, devoted to obviously the writing of some of his greatest pieces, some of the greatest pieces of all of music history. So, for me, I'm thinking of somebody who's just trying to get into this, like if you latch on to the Fifth Symphony or any of his symphonies, like it is totally worth your while to like dig in and actually find out like what was going through his life. What was the world like, during the period that symphony was being written, and it'll kind of change the way, you're listening to this stuff. And we talk about this stuff all the time when we talk about albums, Kanye West, whatever, like the surrounding story about the piece of music just kind of enhances it. And that's totally here with classical music too.
I like that we can't even have a Beethoven episode without mentioning Kanye.
I was just thinking that.
I mean, I'm sure Kanye has compared himself to Beethoven,
definitely.
Times, so.
So yeah, all right. So what is what parts of that background story, really should your first time listener kind of know about? I mean, everybody knows about the deaf stuff, right? Is he going deaf at this time?
Yep. So Beethoven's like in his mid 30s, which is also kind of crazy to think about now that I'm reaching my mid 30s.
Yeah.
There was a human being who would write the Fifth Symphony, and I could never even imagine.
Right.
But anyway, yes, his deafness was already becoming more and more pronounced by this point in time. So we're talking about there's a long development period for this symphony. It's 1804 to 1808, so 4 years. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, Beethoven was incredibly prolific during these 4 years whilst writing the Fifth Symphony. He also wrote his one and only violin concerto. He wrote an entire the fourth piano concerto, and also wrote the Sixth Symphony during this like 4 year period. So it's just like stunning when you really kind of think about that, even if you don't know what a concerto is. But some of these incredible pieces of music were all written at the same time. How is that even possible, right? But I think the most like really like cool thing that kind of brought me to understand, it was a good way of understanding or comparing it, I guess, to like today's world, is the premiere of this symphony, right? So in 1808, he premiered this in Vienna at what turned out to be like a 4.5 hour long concert of just Beethoven music and Beethoven conducting the orchestra. You see the debut of not only the Fifth Symphony, but also the Sixth Symphony. He does that fourth piano concerto I just mentioned. He plays it himself. Like, it just, as a fan, of course, I'm like, this is like, must have been the greatest concert of all time. But, just thinking about how crazy that would have been to sit there for 4.5 hours listening
but then
to
isn't
new music.
The story is that it was like a big disaster, right?
Right,
Because
like the orchestra like had only had like one rehearsal.
It was freezing cold in December.
Cold. They didn't have any heat. I mean, it sounds miserable when you read into it, but of course, 200 something years later, you're like, wow, that must have been amazing.
Yeah,
it was probably awful.
I saw he also did like a piano improv. He's like the Grateful Dead of classical music.
Yeah. As if like, and that was like late in the concert too. As if all of this wasn't enough. He
Everyone's,
just
oh god, it's this Dark Star.
And I was reading something about some person like really wanted to leave because they were very uncomfortable, but like they were in Beethoven's line of sight, and he was such a crazy motherfucker that they didn't dare like stand up. And all this stuff like builds into this mythos of like this mad genius, So Dan, does this kind of like historical background stuff elevate it for you? Do you think it's necessary for first time listeners to know?
I mean, like Beethoven's such a like historical figure that there's no way to go into it with like no knowledge, obviously, the deaf thing. I did, you maybe don't know if he's deaf at this point or whatever, but the first couple listens, I like intentionally didn't read any information about it, because I only knew, what everybody knows. And, then I read the Wikipedia and, I read about like that concert and stuff. And, I found it interesting and all, but I don't think it like enlightened the piece too much, or opened a door for me. I just felt like, oh, now I know some trivia.
Yeah, okay. And and there's other stuff that I think is pretty interesting, like Beethoven's politics and the politics of the time. There's a lot of revolution in the air in the early 19th century with the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. I guess Beethoven's political beliefs are a little bit I don't know, difficult to determine for sure, of course, but, he has this he's associated with this like revolutionary spirit and a lot of this like triumph and, struggle and fight and everything comes into play.
But at the same time, he's like, his patrons are like powerful, royalty basically that pay him for these compositions. So it's interesting.
It definitely complicates things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've also got interesting historical aspects to Beethoven. Is like, again, please no hate mail, but to simplify things, almost single-handedly like moving the world from like classical music into romantic music, like into the romantic period. And there's also a lot of interesting stuff about the legacy of Beethoven and this symphony in particular. I think this symphony is obviously like a highlight. It is one of these things that's identified as like this mixture between, it's like sort of structured like a classical piece, and yet it's got like this like wildness that is associated with the Romantic era. Music would never be the same after this symphony. You've got other issues that I wanted to mention, like the rise of nationalism in the 19th century and how like, because his work is so like triumphant and, it's like gets associated with the German spirit, and like eventually with, even like Nazism. And yet at the same time, this symphony in particular becomes like very central to the Allied forces in World War II. It becomes known as like the Victory Symphony, and associated with like fighting off Nazism. One thing I wanted to mention just for Dan, because I know you're a big space fan, as I'm sure it ends up on the Voyager Golden Record. So
yeah, he actually has 2 pieces on that.
Really? So maybe aliens have even heard Beethoven.
Maybe.
So obviously just like a huge, just so much like peripheral stuff. But let's start with you, Dan. If you were just to describe this symphony to somebody who had never heard it, how would you describe the symphony itself?
I mean, that's like the hardest thing possible. I mean, one, everybody knows that bum 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 thing, and that is
right.
I just feel like that's so. Even if you didn't know that it's from, it's just like so ingrained in like I don't know, culture, I guess.
Right.
It's hard to like explain, but outside of that, I think, like I said before, like just coming into it, first listen before you dive deep or anything. I think like you're gonna get the feeling of like a movie soundtrack. You're gonna feel these strings, this sort of like. It feels like there either is or should be like some sort of narrative attached to it. Yeah. Like you feel like there's a story going on, even if you don't know what that story is or what. It really gives that like sense, I think, to the uninitiated.
Yeah, and I think that it feels kind of like as a whole, to sort of describe the structure of the thing. It starts off like very dark and stormy with this opening movement. And it kind of like, it's not like a smooth path because it gets rather like stately and, grand in the second movement, a little bit darker in the third movement, but then like absolutely triumphant in the last movement. And so it has kind of this like upward trajectory. You know what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, and I think that it's important to mention to fans or new people who are just trying to get into classical music that this form, this four movement form, is kind of a standard. You know what I mean? Even though Beethoven is already sort of breaking away from what's called the classical period or whatever, he is still using four movements. Later on, we see 5, 6. We see multiple, changes. Even his Sixth Symphony kind of deviates from that. But, and the way I always like to think about it is like usually your first movement is, fast in some way. It usually makes a statement. It's kind of like what's supposed to grab your attention, right? And then you usually settle into like a bit of a slower second movement, whatever that is. Somehow it's a little bit slower than the first. The third is kind of just building you up to some sort of climactic fourth movement, which sometimes, like as in the case of the Fifth Symphony, doesn't actually, the third movement flows right into the fourth movement, building right up to it. And that's kind of the function of those four movements. Of course, that varies from symphony to symphony, but in my mind, that was always helpful to just kind of know where I'm at or what to expect when I see like a 4-movement symphony. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's true. And yet I think that there's something sort of innovative about this symphony from what I know, in that it was typical sort of before this to have sort of like it's like your main, your Smells Like Teen Spirit comes first. All right. And then the rest of the symphony is like sort of, explorations and developments of the themes introduced there. So it's sort of, it doesn't usually like crescendo like in a lot of Mozart. You just get this sense of like starts off with like the grand statement, and then we kind of like go off on different excursions throughout that statement. Whereas this, as iconic as the opening movement is, it feels like it's all about the final movement, like
right.
Where as soon as it starts, we're heading there, and that feels like pretty new and also pretty it makes it, I think, more accessible to modern listeners because we're used to sort of, I don't know, post rock or concept albums that sort of build in that way. You know what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on. A lot of other symphonies, as you have mentioned, like don't have the notoriety of like a fourth movement that's as good as the first movement. You know what I mean? And here,
right,
as you mentioned, like it rivals the first movement. Maybe it even like tops it if you really listen to the whole thing. But yeah, it's kind of astounding, right? To think that, it also, I guess compared to like what comes later or even comes before, like there's just so much like energy and excitement, like, and it seems to move rather quickly. You know what I mean? Like there's really not a lot of dull moments where things get like super duper quiet or super duper slow. You know what I mean? Like it kind of always is moving at a fairly brisk pace, and of course that lends itself to the different conductors and how they choose to conduct the music. But this symphony in particular, I think it's just kind of like electrifying throughout.
What you just said, like it doesn't do that thing where it gets like incredibly quiet. That's always been an issue I've had with like classical music.
Sure,
and you know, like if you're not listening on headphones, you know, some pieces, and maybe it's the conductor or whatever, you know, you have to like fucking crank your stereo up, you know, to the max to hear it, and then bam, it goes back. You know, it's like when you watch a movie and there's an explosion. You know, it blows your head off. That's always been like such an annoying, like such a like hindrance to getting into classical music for me. So it is very refreshing that this one doesn't do that.
Yeah, it does strike you as like incredibly tight, like just so labored over to where like not a note is wasted.
Like trimming all the fat off. Yeah.
Just absolutely just goes and goes. And I wonder, Dan, you know, listening to that first movement, I'm just like amazed how it just takes me, and then like I'm just along for the ride, because you know the way it like sort of, you know, rises up, and then like it feels like you're like, you know, flying off a cliff and then just like falling, you know, as like the is like running underneath these like sustained chords, you know. It's like, did you find putting this on that you were just sort of like under its spell, at least in that first movement?
Yeah, I mean, it really, the whole thing, like, you know, does grab your attention and like command your attention, you know, once you allow it to, you know, because it doesn't do those sort of really backgroundy tricks, like I said, like the getting really, really quiet and you know, just sort of lending itself to the background. It does sort of, you know, stay like very active and just keep your attention, which I think makes this like such a great you know, beginner's one. And honestly, I was thinking about it like while I was listening, stuff like that. Is that why this is the most famous one? You know, because I think it does sort of like have a little bridge between classical music and modern, you know, listening because of things like that.
Yeah, and you know, Dan, you're a drummer. There's like a lot of like drums in this, you know. Timpani,
yeah, I do.
They call it in the orchestra, but
I do dig the timpani. The timpani's a rad instrument.
Yeah, I wonder, Dan, though, if like, because I just sort of would expect somebody to put this on and be like, damn, first movement fucking slaps, like Darren was saying, because it just objectively does. Like it never lets you go. It just like keeps on like rushing and rushing and rushing. And even like those pauses, you know, it feels like the pause is like when you're like just cresting over a hill on a roller coaster or something, like, you know, you're about to like fall right back down into it.
Yeah.
But I wonder, Dan, if like after that, how did the middle two movements go? Because I would just expect somebody, this first time listener, to be thrilled by the first movement and then find, especially like the second movement, you know, that kind of, it almost sounds like a standard, like very stately, you know, like aristocratic, like house party music. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that, I can see that. I mean, the middle section, it does get like a little bit into that like stuffy, you know, territory of classical music. Maybe it's because, I mean, I this isn't actually, you know, my first time listening to this or anything. So maybe I'm mildly used to it or whatever. But I think if it loses your attention at a point, you know, that is sort of where it'll happen. And then, like I said, I mean, you know, this sort of feels like a bridge between like the classical and, you know, modern or whatever. And I think that little part is sort of the other side of the bridge, you know, the classical side of the bridge. Because I mean, it's mildly stuffy there, I'll say.
Yeah, well, how would you respond to that, Darren? You know, like all the like bum 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 bum. You know, it just sounds like it's like not Beethoven's fault, but it just feels so like dated, I think, until you get past that initial thing. You know, it's different from the first movie, which I think will grab anybody. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And I kind of just had to understand as I was listening to these that like this is one piece of music, really, right? It's not meant to be looked at as like individual songs on an album, right? Sometimes we talk about albums that have really great bangers, but maybe as a full cohesive record, it just doesn't, it doesn't work, right? We talk about that. With classical music, with a symphony, like, you have to try. I feel like you have to try not to do that too much, right? Like you have to. I always have the expectations that like movements 2 and 3 are probably not going to be as electrifying as 1 and 4. You know what I mean? Like, but there's something there. There's a story to be told, just like you were mentioning, Dan. Like, maybe a movie playing, whatever. Like, there's a reason for these two movements.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be
trying to lead you somewhere, right? Yeah,
it can't be in your face, the whole time. You sort of expect. I mean, in any piece of music, especially like a one, like you said, this isn't an album. It's one piece of music. When you're doing something for how long is it, like 40 something minutes? When you're doing something for that length of time, you can't, if you're just straight pedal to the metal the whole time. Like that's exhausting.
Right.
Yeah. I think that another thing that's important to mention here is the motif. I'll get to this in a second, but we'll call it the fate motif, and we'll dive into that controversy in a second. But the bum. The really cool thing about this symphony, I think, is that, and for some reason it's kind of controversial, but it appears throughout the symphony. Like in each movement, there are points where you get that like same rhythm. Some people like argue that that's just coincidental or something, but I think it's like very clear. You know what I'm saying, Darren? That like the fate motif appears in every movement in different forms, kind of like tying this whole thing together as one piece.
Yeah, most certainly. I am not even going to try to consider what Beethoven was doing with this piece of music for 4 years, but from all that you read, and there's a lot of lore out there about the bum and how he described it, or what Beethoven thought of it. I do believe that like that was the heart of this piece of music from the beginning, and he found a way to keep that as a part of the entire piece of music. And I think that you're just lying to yourself if you think that was some sort of coincidence. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I feel like it would be odd for it to be why would it be coincidence? And something so labored over, you would just accidentally stumble upon the same rhythm, every movement at some point, that kind of seems ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it's like basically indisputable. Like in the third movement, it's like the whole like da 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 da.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same exact thing, and it's like the cool thing about like people like Beethoven, why it's still fun to listen to these like super classic figures, is that you can just kind of trust that they're geniuses and that everything they did was deliberate. Like I really like that comfort. As a listener, I like. Study Shakespeare in school right now, and it's like he has so many like weird fluky things. It just seems like a mistake, like he forgot what this character's name was, so now it's a different character or something like that. But you'd be like, you know what? I trust Shakespeare. I bet there was some reason for this. And maybe you overread sometimes, but it's like it's just comforting to be like, now I get, if I just believe that it was on purpose, now I get to like have fun figuring out why.
Right.
One thing I want to ask is, the issue of instrumentation. Now, when we did our free jazz episode, we talked about like how important it is to kind of appreciate, okay, the band leader has assembled a very specific musical palette. Why did they do that? Ornette Coleman didn't want a piano in there, but Coltrane did. I don't know why I couldn't think of his name. Coltrane wanted a bunch of saxophones, whereas like Coleman wanted a couple, these different strange things. What does Dolphy play? Like a bassoon or something? Whatever. But the point is, the musical palette is obviously really important to classical music because the composer has specifically decided on specific instruments, and there are a couple weird ones here. For example, this is like the first symphony that included trombones, that included piccolos ever, I think. And but how, Darren, when what, like for new listeners, I think all classical music is going to sound the same. So how do you come around to appreciating the specific like palette choices in the instrumentation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no way around, admitting that that's just a bit of a deeper dive. You know what I mean? I don't think that, I don't think knowing that a piccolo is in this symphony is going to make or break somebody getting into classical music. You know what I mean? But I do think that part of the effort of picking a single piece and listening to it over and over again is also learning what is really going on here. What is the orchestra comprised of? As you listen to it over and over again, you start to hear what the cellos are doing. You start to pick up on the thing that the woodwinds are doing. You know what I mean? Because obviously, and this is always what kind of blows my mind when I start thinking about, because being a former musician, right? Most of like pop music, indie music that I listen to inspire me in a way that it's like, yeah, I want to write music. Beethoven doesn't inspire me to write music. It's because it's just too, it'd be too challenging. Can you imagine like having like, trying to write music for all of these instruments and having all these things going on? And when you think about it that way, and then you listen to the piece and you're like, holy shit, there's like so many different things happening between the strings and the percussion and the brass and the woodwinds, that repeated listenings really then kind of help you understand what these textures are doing. And then you start thinking about, well, why did he choose to have a piccolo? Why did he choose to include the trombone?
Exactly,
you know what I mean? It just expands and, I don't know, deepens the experience for me.
Yeah, I think that's what, you want to do, because, there are parts like where, everything drops out and it's just like the cellos like, dun, 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 dun. Why are the cellos doing that? It's like, maybe it's a deeper dive area, but it's like, ask yourself why. You mentioned that there's like a shit ton of timpani on this symphony. That's not true of every symphony ever written, obviously. So like, why so much timpani? I mean, Dan, did you find yourself like interested in some of these musical palette choices, or do you feel like it just feels so much like quote unquote classical music that you didn't really notice?
I mean, I had a week and a half, with the, so which is a short amount of time to like, learn such a important piece of music and all. So, at first, like I really did just listen to it, and it did just sort of sound like quote unquote classical music. But I did make a point to like read the Wikipedia and see what instruments were in it, because, I mean, honestly, I didn't know what everything was. I mean, obviously, a violin and whatnot, but I don't know if I could tell you a piccolo from a regular flute, just off the top of my head or whatnot, So I did make a point to read that. I think still just after a week and a half, I don't have it like memorized. I couldn't. I couldn't tell you. Oh, yeah, I love the piccolos and the third whatever kind of thing. But if it was like something that I was going to continue to like dive deeper in and wanted to learn more about, I think that it would definitely like become beneficial. Because like you said, with like jazz, jazz is something that especially free jazz, something I'm very into. And so when I listen to that now, I can say I know what's what and everything, and that comes from like experience and just constantly learning as listening to it, looking at the Wikipedia or CD booklet or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you have to like intellectualize it so much, because there's not going to be a good answer usually, but it's just like, I think if you're a first time listener, it's worth kind of like observing when things are, why they are sort of colored the way they are. So it's like here, that contrabassoon and the trombones only play in the fourth movement. So it's like, you could sort of ask yourself like, man, he wanted that thing to boom, he wanted some like some extra boom on that last, and it just sort of like adds to the experience, getting inside of his head a little bit. What I want to ask now is, you mentioned this a little bit, Dan, like imagining a movie in your head or something, but do you feel kind of like compelled to imagine a narrative while you're listening to this? Like imagine themes, there's so much like mythology around this. Basically, not to get like too into the weeds, but there was like some guy that was like a student or associate of Beethoven who said that Beethoven told him that the bum 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 is supposed to be fate knocking at the door. And it turns out that this guy was like kind of full of shit about everything he said. He just was like often like
He was
bragging
like a
about his
protege or
very
something, yeah.
Yeah, he like wanted to like pretend like he had a much closer relationship with Beethoven than anybody else, and he was probably lying. So that's like often dismissed. There's and yet there's like almost always, if you listen to like analyses of this or read analyses of this symphony, it's like talks about like a heroic struggle or something, like, because as you listen, you often hear there's like an immense like stormy darkness in the opening movement, and then it gets quite like joyous and triumphant as it moves along, and yet there'll be those moments where like that kind of like minor sort of key comes back in and like just kind of reminds you of the first movement or whatever. Of course, we move from like a C minor to a C major in the last movement, which makes it very like triumphant. So what do you think about all that, Darren? Do you think it's useful to imagine kind of a narrative like some warrior fighting against fate or something, or are you sort of like missing the point there?
Yeah, I'm going to say no, that I've never really bought into any of that, and I'll tell you why. I've kind of felt like classical music has been such a personal experience for me, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that like what you're listening to is an interpretation, right? When we listen to a pop record, the Beatles' White Album, there is only one Beatles' White Album. There's only there's multiple interpretations, I suppose, but like there's only one recording, right?
Yeah.
There's only one interpretation of
yeah.
the Beatles' music, right? It's their interpretation. That's all there is. When it comes to classical music, there are so many interpretations, and we will obviously get into it with these two specific recordings. That, I mean, truly, you could arguably say that the same piece of music, but recorded and performed by two different orchestras, can have a totally different, like, narrative, totally different emotion, like all of the things that you're looking for could totally differ, and then you gravitate towards whichever one speaks to you more. So that's where like the personal experience comes from. I think it's really cool. Like I'm not like the whole fate knocking at the door. I could see it. I could understand why that might work as an interpretation, but like to me, that's not why I listen to the Fifth Symphony. I'm not thinking about a warrior fighting some dramatic war or anything like that. It's not like that at all for me. Like for me, it's just it's a totally different experience.
Yeah, what do you think, Dan? Did you find yourself like imagining a specific story in your head?
No, I mean, I just sort of felt like there should be a story. I didn't really... I like I said, I purposely didn't like read much about it. Like at least the first couple times I listened to it, once I read the fate knocking at a door, you're like, oh yeah, sounds like somebody like, doing the pounding of a fist on the door and all. But again, I thought that because somebody told me that. It wasn't like I didn't come to that on my own. I think the reason like you come up with a theme or story or feel like there should be one is because in like pop music, you sort of especially with lyrics, you sort of like, even if you don't fully understand the lyrics or the meaning behind them, you're still like they're sort of giving you whatever the narrative is. I mean, even something like I am the walrus that's purposely nonsensical. It's still like you think of what the walrus looks like. What's the Eggman? Like it's still it's sort of it's giving you these images. Whereas something like this without. And not just classical music, as sort of any instrumental music, it's sort of like giving that part over to you. So I think if you want it to be a heroic struggle in your mind, if it's fate knocking at the door for you, then cool. If it's something else, then cool.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that it's like it can be sort of detrimental to like attach a very specific image to these different sounds and movements. It just sort of like cheapens it in a way. And it's weird because we feel this compulsion to do it with classical music because we're trying to get it, quote unquote. But when you listen to like Godspeed You Black Emperor or something, like Explosions in the Sky, you're not thinking like, oh, this buildup sounds like, a miner walking up a hill, you don't.
But I think that's a kind of a bad example because I think everybody does ascribe like something, especially to Godspeed. They have this sort of like reputation as being like apocalyptic and like anarchist and stuff. But like there's no lyrics that give you that. But like sort of everybody kind of arrives at that similar
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess like there is sort of an aesthetic, and there's an aesthetic around Beethoven, obviously. So it's like hard not to think about his personality and his like,
Sure.
you know, he's very, very temperamental, very mad genius kind of style, and sort of implant that on like the storminess of the music. But it, you know, I just think of like the specific images, like, oh, that chord progression is a bird singing, or what, you know, like I think that really sort of like robs the thing of its power. And it's best to just like sort of let it wash over you and try to appreciate it as pure music or something. Although there are things that are really indisputable in the sense of like there are parts of Godspeed that sound very apocalyptic. Like they just, you know, it would be impossible to listen to some of their pieces and say, this is about being happy, you know, like there are just moments where that's just not arguable. Right. And there are moments here where it's like the last movement. You cannot argue that the last movement is like not triumphant, you know, like at the very least we have to agree on that. Now I want to sort of move on, and we'll obviously continue talking about the symphony itself, but move on to these specific performances. We're talking about, again, Carlos Kleiber from 1974 and John Elliott Gardner from 1995 or 4. Maybe I mixed up. Oh, no, 4. Okay, so...
Not experts, Lisa.
These... Yeah, not experts. So these are the two performances we chose to really focus on for this episode. Darren, can you speak to like why it's important to hear? You sort of started to, but like why is it important to seek out different interpretations of the same piece?
Well, I mean, there's tons to talk about regarding that. I guess number one, you know, there are no recordings of Beethoven conducting his symphonies, right? There's not a recording of it. So all that we are left with is the sheet music. And, you know, sheet music, without getting too much into musical theory, it does give quite a bit of direction, you know, tempo and repeats and do the, you know, even there's sometimes like notes, maybe even written on the sheet music. But ultimately, it is still left up to the imagination and the interpretation of the conductor. And that conductor, very similar to the composer, has a personality, has its, you know, has his own life. Like there's already something to be said about that, right? How is he going to interpret it? How is he reading the narrative, right? Does he read it like a warrior struggle or whatever? Like just what we were just discussing between ourselves, like that same experience happens to the conductor, and then he is leading the orchestra towards that vision, right? And so between just these two, for instance, you know, I think they're extremely different. Some conductors, as with John Elliott Gardner, like to do what's called a period piece, right? Or more historical specific, like trying to make sure that the instruments are tuned the way they would have been back in 1808. You know, trying to play at the pace as close to what exactly is written on the sheet music as possible, whereas others will completely change things, maybe even remove sections of the original score of the original sheet music because of whatever reason that they're trying to interpret it. And we can talk about that. I don't know if you want to get into that regarding the Fifth Symphony and that whole repeat in the scherzo, the third movement. Yeah.
I want to come back around to that when we get to Gardner, but I want to start with Kleiber for a second. And you're right to mention that there is, you know, that's sort of the fun thing about classical is that now we have like extra background. If you're a background kind of guy, like I am, there's more background. I don't want to like dive too deep into it, but like Carlos Kleiber, he's pretty much like an absolute legend conductor. And what makes him so interesting, I think, is there's like a lot of mystery surrounding him. He has like a very, very small recorded output. Seems to have been like just an absolute perfectionist. He has like a pretty famous Tristan and Isolde, which I think was like his last recording. And he basically was like working on it with his orchestra and just eventually decided he was unhappy and stormed out. But there were enough recordings of like rehearsals and stuff that the record label just released it, you know, which he was very pissed about. But he, you know, just compared to most conductors, he like recorded very, very little. I think I read he gave one interview in his entire life, one known interview. He was known as being like very temperamental, very, very crazy, kind of Beethoven-esque in a way. There's also a lot of interesting stuff to say about the historical moment, right, of 1974 when this was recorded. it's, obviously very different from the early 1800s. And you think about with this whole legacy of like, the Fifth Symphony in particular, moving through the rise of nationalism in Germany, co-opted by, Nazis and whatnot, and then re-co-opted by the Allies fighting the Nazis as a sign of victory and, revolution and struggle against tyranny. And then you get this basically Austrian or German, I think he's German-born Austrian conductor interpreting this piece in 1975 with the weight of all that history. You know what I'm saying, Dan? How it's just like a very different historical moment to think about what does Beethoven mean in 1974. Does any of that stuff interest you when thinking about a specific performance of a piece?
I mean, yeah. Normally, I'm a big background guy. Anything that I get into, I usually get real into it. I'll read a book or something. This I wasn't into enough, and I purposely was sort of trying to. I'm the one in this episode that's the novice and all. So I was sort of, purposely not becoming an expert on things and all. So I didn't really get into all that very much at all.
But it's interesting, right?
Yeah,
because,
yeah, of course, yeah.
Because you think about something like, I don't know, Wagner or whatever, right? Which is like very, very associated with Nazism in the early 20th century, nationalism. Think about like what was the first Wagner performance after World War II? The horrors of World War II. Like the weight that it adds to that and the way that the music changes, where it was once like a celebration of the German spirit and now has all this like shame and horror associated with it, really changes the way a piece is interpreted, but also just the way a piece sounds to us. How much of this stuff do you think about when listening, Darren? Because I think about first-time listeners are probably going to be tempted to be like, I just want to pick a performance that's going to get me closest to understanding Beethoven. But it's kind of like a fool's errand, and you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't think about the historical context of the performance itself, right?
Yeah, I do think, though, I do think it can potentially scare people off to think that, like, oh my God, now I've got to like understand the background of the conductor and the year that this recording was done, and even for me, I think a lot of my early listenings was just trying different things. It was not, I kind of like relied on sources that were telling me, hey, these are important recordings, or this is a really good recording. You should listen to this. Like that was kind of what guided me. And then if I connected or I liked the performance, then I would kind of dig in a bit deeper and become a bigger fan of this conductor. And then from there, you check out other great recordings from that particular conductor. But I don't think that it is, necessary to have to understand all of that while you're still just trying to get into it. You agree with that, Gabe, right?
I do, but I also think that like, I think of it like movies, like film adaptations.
Sure.
So like just last year, Little Women came out by Greta Gerwig, and it's like a very 2019 take on Little Women. I guess I don't want to spoil it, but it's got like the concerns of women of today. Whereas there was like a very famous like mid 90s version of Little Women, which was very, very 90s. There's a Little Women like from like a silent film from the 20s or something that is really reflects the 20s, and I just think it's like,
yeah,
it just makes it richer if you think about the context of Beethoven and the context of the performer. Now, Dan, I feel like this is sort of a tough question, and maybe it's impossible not to bounce back and forth between the two pieces, performances we're going to talk about. But like, how would you say that Kleiber interprets the Fifth Symphony? Like, what were just your initial thoughts listening to Kleiber specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that is really difficult for me to answer after just, like a week and a half of listening to these two. Because also, like, I realize I don't 100% know what a conductor does. Obviously, I know he's the guy who's like waving the stick, and and I know
that's all he does. He just waves his arm around.
He just waves, and he's like, I hope everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. But I mean, I know like that, like that's controlling like the tempo, and he's like saying louder, quieter. But like, I don't really get like if the music's written down, like I don't get why this guy is so important over like, oh, this one's got the best celloist in the world. Like that feels like I feel like that part just from my lack of knowledge or whatever, like that part seems more important to me. Like, oh, you got to hear, the I forget which orchestra, is this one, but like it's odd to me that like it's not like, oh, you got to hear the London Symphony Orchestra, do it or something. Like I don't really, I don't think I 100% know why it's the conductor. That is the reason.
Well, how would you explain that, Darren? Like, why is like the conductor the auteur of the classical world, really?
Right. So, I think it's because everyone has to adhere to their interpretation, right? So conductors will jump to different orchestras. They're not always like tied for their entire career to the same orchestra. So, there's like a bit of importance when like, Solti goes from like the Chicago Symphony Orchestra to the London Symphony Orchestra. Like there's an honor. Obviously, the London Symphony Orchestra has seen plenty of different conductors, but when Solti steps in, there's a certain, there's a change because he favors certain parts of the orchestra to be louder or to be featured more. Thinking about like the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, a lot of people will say they're really big on brass. Well, why is that? Every orchestra has like a brass section. Maybe it's because they are just louder, or maybe they add additional brass players to their performances because they just, it's just something that they want to be able to bring out. So that's kind of something that the conductor can do. They show up, I imagine, they talk to all of the performers, they talk them through the piece, they tell them, yes, this section needs to be louder, this section needs to be faster, whatever, even if it's deviating from what is literally written down on the sheet music. It's the conductor that is determining. He's driving the ship. You know what I mean? And you've got to keep up, right? He's gonna. If you don't, you get thrown out, right? I mean, that's kind of.
I think it's useful to think of it like the director of a film versus the writers and the actors. Who's the most important? Like the actor is the symphony, the writer is the composer, and the director is the conductor. And I think like conductors, when they're going to perform a piece, they spend like months, sometimes years, just like studying the score, right? And they're looking for like how they see it, right? And that can mean like drawing out certain emotions from certain passages, the, power or emphasis or speed of different passages. It's just like if somebody, trying to think of an example, like David Bowie or something, right? I don't think he like played many instruments on his records, right? He's like directing musicians to play the music as he hears it. Right. And it's like the bass player starts playing a bass line that Bowie, I guess, has written. And, Bowie might say, that no, hit that second note softer, on that third note, really, hit it hard, maybe like slide up to that fourth note, like there's so much, because he's just got a sound in his head. I think the conductor reads the score and gets the sound in their head, and they like force the orchestra to recreate it as they hear it, which can be very different. I
guess what I don't fully understand or whatever is like you said with like Bowie, like I understand that like Bowie wrote the song, it's his song, he's hearing it in his head, even though, maybe he can't, or, he doesn't have like the proficiency to like record it all himself. He's the one who wrote it. It's in his head. This is somebody reading somebody else's work and then interpreting it so that somebody else can. It's like you're adding a middleman in here. That's the part that is odd to me, I think.
Right, but kind of going back to my original point, like there's not an original recording of. No,
I get that, but the score, it's written down, right. And I get you don't have 100% of the information, so I understand that the conductor like adds sort of that say 10%'s missing, yeah, exactly, like you're filling in the gaps, and that I get, but I don't know, it just seems really odd to me that that's what's important, and not the orchestra.
Yeah, I mean, I think just because the orchestra is doing exactly what the conductor tells them to do. And, on that note, Darren, how would you describe how Kleiber interprets the Fifth?
So, I think that the easiest way to try to describe it in the simplest terms is that this is one of the most dramatic, one of the most romantic, one of the most energized reads, I think, of the Fifth Symphony. I think, and it's important to me as a listener, the sound quality of the recording is also really, really important. You know what I mean? Like, and it's hard because like I guess if you were there live or if you saw it performed live, it wouldn't matter. You would then truly just be listening to the entire orchestra in that conductor's interpretation. But when you hear it in like the form of a recording, headphones on, there's a clear difference in like how well mic'd the cellos are or the violins and stuff.
Right.
And on this particular recording, like you can hear the bows like going across the cello strings. You know what I mean? You can hear the sounds of like seats moving and breathing and all this kind of stuff. Like it's like a close mic'd type of recording. And that's important. I mean, that's to me, that's part of the interpretation. That's what we get, right? Like, when comparing these two different recordings, like they sound like they're recorded differently, in terms of like where the mic is placed and what you're truly hearing. So that kind of adds into the drama for me, like the almost like rawness of the interpretation, like being able to hear the instruments so loud, like the notes are drawn out. Like it's not just like bum 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 bum. It's like bum 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 bum. Like there's a little extra emphasis, even if it's just like a millisecond more. It's notable in comparison to other interpretations.
Yeah, I think that it feels very grand, very lush. Some of that might due to doubling of certain instruments, which you mentioned earlier, Darren, but sometimes conductors will decide to double certain parts of the orchestra to like really emphasize them. And I think for me, like the thing that stands out most when I'm listening to this is the second movement, which has like these very like beautiful kind of romantic in the sense of like romance sense, strings in these soft mellow parts. It's like just very lush and sort of like sensual. And, you think about, maybe it's useful just to start jumping back and forth, but you think about Gardner's performance, which strips away a lot of that doubling and it becomes a lot less lush. It becomes more like precise and more like cutting. The big parts, like you mentioned, Darren, they sound like a hammer compared to Gardner, who sounds more like a razor or something,
right.
There's just like a hugeness to this. And, to sort of start making that transition so we can jump back and forth. The 20th century sees, to give you the short version, like classical music becomes very, very big, very grand, very emphasized, very influenced by this romanticism, which is like the music should be huge. The music should be like just so grand and so
loud
magnificent,
and,
Yeah. And it starts to become like a little bit over the top. So you have somebody like John Eliot Gardner, who in the 80s and 90s starts to become a leading figure of, what's called this historically informed performance or historically informed practices. They often make use of, like you said, Darren, period accurate instruments. Because the instruments have sort of evolved and changed to become louder, to become like fuller sounding, et cetera, over the years. But they try to get back to like what it would have sounded like in the 1800s. They really focus in on like the research aspect and like respecting original intentions. So, we'll get to this, but like there's a note to repeat a portion of the third movement here. And, there's some debate about it, but a lot of people just ignore it. They don't repeat like the whole first
it's
half
like a
of
really long repeat. Like and the recordings, by comparison, it's 2 minutes longer.
Yeah.
Gardner's version.
Yeah. So you notice that Kleiber just cuts that part.
Yeah.
Whereas Gardner wants to respect it because his whole mission is to like really get at the the accuracy. They generally don't do this doubling business because it's just not how it would have sounded at the time. They believe that Beethoven would have written for, 4 violins if he wanted 4 instead of 2. And this is the part that is so weird to me, right? So it's basically rebelling against the kind of stuffy traditionalists, which is ironic because they're the traditionalists,
Right.
It's like,
right.
Like basically they're so traditional that it's got like sort of a punk rock element, and it's like hard to appreciate from the outside, but like this historically informed practices movement is extremely controversial when it first starts. And Beethoven, Gardner's Beethoven is like this watershed moment that kind of like opens everybody's eyes to how rich the possibilities could actually be. Like, it's not just a novelty thing. It's actually like worth following. Dan, do you hear, when you listen to these recordings back to back, you know, do you hear that difference? Like, do you hear that kind of spirit of like, you know, fuck the old guard when you're listening to Gardner?
I mean, at first, like, really, no. I even took these, and I made another playlist where I did like the first movement of, you know, Kleiber, and then I did the first one. This, you know, listen to it twice, you know, but you know, one and one, whatever, because it really was like sort of difficult to like tell that, you know, obviously like the track links were different, and I could tell, you know, like that one thing wasn't repeated. Gardner seems like faster sometimes.
Yeah, he's like going at like a white heat.
I mean, like, honestly, I think if you just played one and then played the other one for me and I didn't really know anything, I don't think I would super notice. Really what I noticed the most is what Darren was talking about, like the miking and stuff. But I think like you hear that like on Gardner, the timpani is just booming. Yeah.
You know, it feels like so present, whereas it's like a little bit more in the mix on Kleiber. Like, would you agree with that, Darren?
Yeah, it was just because everything else is so loud. That the timpani kind of gets buried a bit on Kleiber's interpretation. But I mean, yeah, just looking at, you know, I'm just looking at my playlist where I've got both of them next side by side and looking at the track or the timing of each one. You know, every single movement between the two is at least between a minute to 2 minutes of difference, right? With obviously Kleiber being longer and Gardner being shorter. And I mean, that's a lot of time, I feel like.
Yeah,
and that just speaks to exactly how strict Gardner seems to be to exactly what the tempo is and sticking to that tempo. But also, I think it's like it's almost like a punk rock thing where it's like, you know, these pieces, I listen, you know, he's like sitting there like, I listen to Kleiber, I listen to like all these, you know, legacy conductors from the past, and it sounds so stiff, it sounds so boring. Like, this music is supposed to be alive, it's supposed to like give you a rush, you know, make your heart race. It's like bringing Beethoven back into the fold, you know, making it a little bit less about the, you know, personality of the conductor and their interpretation, and more about the artist's original intent. You know what I mean?
But also, I mean, that's totally a myth. You know what I mean? Because this is Gardner's, you know, who's to say that like Gardner is more accurate really than Beethoven? There are a lot of reasons we could talk about why, but it's like, you know, he's just trying to like shake it loose. You know what I'm saying, Dan? Like, he's like, if I really rip through this and like tear the roof off the motherfucker, like, people will realize how great Beethoven is again. It won't sound like stuffy background music.
It's just so strange to me, you know, from the outside. Like, you would think that like his approach would be the one people would appreciate, you know, like say the White Album was lost, and, you know, people remade it. Like, wouldn't everyone want the one that sounded the closest to the real White Album? You know, it's just so strange that what he's doing is
that's
controversial.
A really interesting question, actually.
But also,
let's say we never had the White Album, right? And, you know, you heard like somebody had this theory, like, oh, you know, the Beatles were a rock band. You know, they like, I've read historical documents that like girls like just screamed at the top of their lungs the whole time they were playing, and people lost their minds, you know, and like they said they were bigger than Jesus. They were like really rebellious. And so I have the score for this song, Long, 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 and I'm ripping through it as fast as possible. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's true.
Like,
that's true.
Maybe there would be information on the score that would say you're not supposed to play like too fast, but he's like, I'm trying to bring urgency back to Long, 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 you know? Whereas some other guy is like, no, Long, Long, Long needs to be like very mellow and very slow. You know?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And the other thing I think of it too, and we sort of talked about this on our like Abbey Road when we did the remaster, like, is like Kleiber and stuff, is he sort of like, you know, remastering it for the modern times? Like we said with like Abbey Road, you know, that like, is it good that people are taking the Beatles work and changing things about it to match the, you know, today, the contemporary listener. So I guess at one aspect I can like sort of see the point in that. But I don't know, it's just very strange that like doing it the way that, you know, historically correct is the punk version, you know?
Yeah, it's very bizarre. But like, you know, one thing that I hear a lot, which I think is a good argument, I wonder what you think about it, Darren, is like, you know, a lot of people talk about Beethoven symphonies. They feel like they're basically written like at the absolute limit of what was capable at the time. You know, like he's pushing so hard that, you know, it's sort of like a strange thing to say, but it's like if he had the instruments we have, the modern versions, he would have used them. You know, if he had the capabilities we have, he was going for the big grand sound of Kleiber, let's say. And so why not, you know, he just couldn't because of his limitations.
Yeah, why not give it to him?
Why not why not take it there? Are you sympathetic to that at all, Darren?
Absolutely. I mean, I really do think that that's totally a fair point to make. You know what I mean? You know, you think about like Mahler in that second symphony with like I think it's like the Symphony of 1,000 Voices or whatever. He has like this massive, like, you know, choral and everything. You know, Beethoven could never even have imagined trying to do something like that because during his time, just in his time, you know, having a choral was like unheard of, right? He does it in his Ninth Symphony and it's like groundbreaking, right? So then Mahler takes that, you know, into the next century, doing it bigger and, you know,
right.
That argument, I think he only does that because Beethoven did it, right? And he's expanding upon that, what was originally laid out by Beethoven. So, you know, if you threw Beethoven up into Mahler's time or even further along, like, of course, he would be using whatever was like available to him and probably even trying to push it beyond what was available at the time too. I think that's totally fair to say. Now, you know, again, we'll get into, I think, whose performance is better here, which one we prefer. All I'm saying is that, like, I do understand the idea that, like, hey, like, let's make it sound like what Beethoven would have sounded like had he written this in today's world, you know?
Yeah, and I think, like, maybe that helps answer your question a little bit, Dan, which is, like, you know, Kleiber would have been reading the score, right? And he's actually taking liberties, but the point of those liberties is to, like, you know, capture the spirit, the true spirit of the piece, you know? Yeah. He's like, if I double this, if I emphasize this, I'll get at the thing, you know?
Right.
And, you know, so it's like, are you sympathetic to that, Dan? Like, it's not like respecting the score is not necessarily the best choice for the piece.
Yeah, I mean, I like to help myself, you know, like I said with the remaster thing, you know, I guess that makes sense, you know, if the Beatles had the recording studio of 2019,
would the drums all be in one channel? You know, probably
yeah,
not.
exactly. So I think there's something to that, but at least, you know, with the Beatles, two of them are still alive who can put the stamp of approval on it, you know. I mean, Beethoven's, you know, long dead, but you know, I mean, I guess there's something to that. When you explain it like that, I think I do sort of appreciate the non-traditional look at it or whatever. Then,
yeah. Well, let's sort of get into what you mentioned, Darren. Like which of these we prefer. Part of the reason why we picked these two pieces, one is because they represent these two different schools of thought, but also it's like kind of bizarre that, you know, 1994, it's almost like this watershed moment for Gardner because this Beethoven set like really kind of legitimizes the historically informed practices in a new way. And it's now like kind of, it's just not even controversial anymore. It's like really just another thing that some people like, some people don't. But, you know, it's just like not like the punk thing that it once was. But also in 1995, Kleiber's fifth and his performance of Beethoven's seventh are grouped together on this CD, which is now for some reason like the most famous like classical single CD that exists for some reason, like Kleiber's fifth and seventh. Like I don't know why. Maybe we could talk about it, but it's like between 1994 and 1995, I just suspect that there were a lot of people who were listening to these two interpretations side by side, you know, because they were both just coming out. And so it's not crazy to be thinking about them in you know, comparison with each other. But on that note, Dan, did you find yourself gravitating toward one of these more than the other?
I mean, I think if I prefer one or the other, I like the Kleiber one more, but mostly just because I think it's like a better recording, like sound wise. Like I really like close miking, like Darren was saying. So it's cool to hear like the chair squeak. It's like I like audio stuff. So like in that respect, like I would pick that one. Just also that like that one sort of just sounds like, my limited knowledge of this, like I've heard it. Maybe I couldn't tell you who was the conductor, but this one just sort of sounds like the one that, like, if I think about it in my head, what it sounds like, it just, I don't, is this the one they use in movies and all? Like, I feel like probably. It at least sounds like the ones they do.
Yeah.
What do you prefer, Darren?
Well, early on, I would have definitely said Kleiber. I was a big Kleiber fan. I actually really loved this interpretation for a long, long time, and actually kind of scoffed at Gardner because I just felt like it wasn't as like muscular and bold and in your face. But over the years, I've actually come to enjoy Gardner's interpretation like much more, like much more.
Wow, I cannot believe this.
Yeah. I will say, of his 9 symphonies that he did, Gardner, really, it's the 3rd and the 5th that I love probably the most. I'm not huge fans of the other ones. I like his interpretations of basically the 1st through the 5th. Everything after that, not so much. But yeah, I there's a lot of reasons why I feel like I gravitated towards this. I love the idea, and this probably comes from the idea of just like getting more into like the history of Beethoven and stuff. And I feel like Gardner is just a little bit closer to what I feel like Beethoven would have sounded like, you know what I mean? And that just became more and more important to me. And I like the quick tempo, I think that's sort of what, when you think about Beethoven as the mad genius and the, just kind of who he was, I think that just seems closer to, what we understand Beethoven to have been. I mean, that's all we can go off of. Kleiber's interpretation has become much more of like so much more romanticized to me, and although I do love the recording quality of it, like you were mentioning, Dan, I really love hearing. I especially feel like the cellos are really brought out incredibly well on Kleiber, and I'm like a huge fan of the cello, so I'm like very attached to that. But overall, it is just a little more drawn out, a little more dramatic, and that's just not something that I am as attached to anymore. What about you, Gabe? Yeah,
I'm a Gardner fan for sure. But I recognize that there's sort of limitations to his approach here. And I agree with you that like some of the symphonies on this whole set, they just don't work, because I think that Gardner is really interested in this like kind of precision and this clarity. And there are parts of Beethoven that are really like well served by the lushness and the sensuousness. I mentioned earlier, like that second movement, like I just feel like it's just so interesting, because on one hand, Kleiber, he makes it like just so gorgeous, those quiet parts. And I don't really get that at all from Gardner's. And yet there are parts, like the kind of the second time, like I think I wrote down like 3.5 minutes in, that the like sort of soft part comes in, there are these like very fast tempo strings like kind of gliding over the top of them, and Gardner hits those with like such precision and such clarity that it's like better, because Kleiber, it becomes sort of like a mush, where like the sensuousness is great, but then you lose kind of like the rhythmic aspect of those soft parts. You sacrifice some of the lushness in Gardner, but then you really get the precision of the rhythm. And in this symphony in particular, I think like rhythm is almost like the most important part of the whole thing. So that's why I feel like specifically his 5th, I just adore it. And there are parts with that wild spirit you mentioned, like just shines through, and I feel like it really does get me closer to Beethoven in some way. The ending of the 4th movement, it just sounds like it's coming off the hinges. Whereas I feel like in Kleiber, it feels very much like we lead into that amazing transition between the third and the fourth movement. And Kleiber is like saving some energy. I just can feel it. I don't know why, but like he's saving a little energy, a little oomph for the ending, where it feels pulled back. When Gardner's fourth movement starts, I'm like, how is he going to keep this up the whole time? Like, because he's starting at 11. And then somehow he finishes on 12. It's like, it just sounds so incredible, like just capturing a moment. And I also like that a lot, where it's like, that is a cool part of Kleiber, like you mentioned, Dan, that like you hear some of those like imperfections, those like, the bows scratching and chairs squeaking or whatever. But I feel like I get a lot of that from Gardner, which is like you're listening to a moment, like just a single performance, and like the magic that happened in that room when like all, shit hits the fan as that movement crescendos at the end of it. And it's like, it's not going to sound like that every night, but we got like this one recording of this really amazing moment. So to kind of shift into wrapping up, Dan, I'm curious, how would you say it went? Do you feel like you got into classical music in the past 2 weeks?
I mean, it went okay. I didn't get into it. I think that time's
So we're not going to just do like all classical music from now on?
No,
I'm really hoping.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, like I sort of said at the top, this isn't like my sort of thing. In music and art, I like stuff that's breaking the rules. I like the punk. I like the Dada. I like
it was once breaking the rules.
Yeah, 200 years ago. Like now it's not. It's associated. You think of classical music, you think of the stuffy white guy party or something. And like. It's just not my thing. This was fine. I didn't hate listening to it. I didn't dislike listening to it. It's just fine. I think I might have gotten more into classical if we had done not the most famous thing ever. This was like staring at the Mona Lisa for 2 weeks. It's like what what else can you say or learn about this incredibly famous thing? But I didn't dislike it at all.
So you're not adding any of this to your banger playlist or anything?
No, I don't think so.
Do add the what's it called? A fifth of Beethoven from the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack.
Oh yeah,
it's like that disco version of this.
It's so
of
good.
The first movement.
Yeah,
oh my god! Add that to the banger playlist. It's sort of a shame because it is true that like this was once the most revolutionary thing that anybody had ever heard. And it's. You get these moments, I guess you have to be sort of in the classical music world, but you get these moments like a John Elliott Gardner, right? Or like a Glenn Gould with Bach or something where it's like, it is like kind of captures that revolutionary spirit where all of a sudden you're just like, oh, damn, I remember now that this was once, just shook the world, and I can feel it again. And I think that's what a lot of conductors are after, and it's worth kind of like chasing that high because it does feel stuffy eventually. I feel like the first time I listened to the Kleiber recordings, it blew my mind, but it's like now I associate it with the traditionalist, kind of thing, and it just sounds a little duller than Gardner, which still sounds exciting to me. But what did you gain from this kind of deep dive into a symphony very well, Darren?
Well, I mean, it was interesting trying to rethink like how I got into classical music because it really does feel like a genre that like once you kind of get into it, you get so embedded into it, and you've listened to maybe like 10 or 15 different interpretations of the Fifth Symphony. I've gone and I've seen like the Florida Orchestra. I've seen it in different ways. It was interesting just trying to like drill down to just these two performances and really thinking about it again. Actually, it was pretty exciting and fun because it has kind of been a long time, and I was really having a classical itch. In fact, whilst going through these 2 weeks, I was going into other Beethoven pieces just because I couldn't help myself. But no, and I think that it was really interesting because I don't think I've ever. Or at least it's been a long time since I've just really put two performances like head to head for a long time. And probably before we started doing this, I probably would have thought that Kleiber and Gardner probably would have felt pretty close to each other for me. But coming away from it, Gardner kind of stands like, almost head and shoulders above, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I just want to sort of like tack on some final thoughts about getting into classical music. For me, it's like, I don't know. For me personally, it's just like allmusic.com is my favorite place to read classical reviews. I think, it's sort of like not the golden age of all music, but for some reason classical they've always done a great job with. And they have this sort of advanced search feature where you can look at like the classical recordings that they've given 5 stars. I think that it's just really rewarding to pick one piece, like we mentioned at the top, and just like check out lots of different recordings. I mean, I think you'll be amazed at like the differences you hear. And, it's kind of like, again, the search for that high of like something this well known when it moves you once again. It's like just so incredible. Dan, I feel like I know the answer, but do you think that like everybody should make this effort? And when I say everybody, I mean people who are into the kind of music we normally talk about on this podcast. Should those people make an effort to kind of get into classical music?
I mean, if you're listening to a podcast about music, you probably like music a lot. So I think like, I mean, at least personally, I feel like it's worth learning about any sort of music that has any kind of importance. There's always some benefit of knowledge gain, but I don't think like knowing Beethoven's going to give you a deeper sense of why you love the Beatles or something. But I think it's at least worth giving it a try.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much anybody could find something they like, because it's not all like Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach. It's like there are a lot of different styles of 20th century stuff that you said you kind of dig, Dan.
Exactly.
There's plenty of that to explore, and you can kind of go backwards from there and see what else sticks. Maybe we just close on this, Darren. Let's say that one of our listeners really enjoyed following along with this experiment. They love the Fifth Symphony. They love Kleiber. They love Gardner. Where would this new classical music fan go next? I'm thinking composers, conductors, whatever. What would you recommend?
Well, personally, I'm, a huge fan of Beethoven, so I would stick around with Beethoven. And you really can't go wrong with exploring the 9 symphonies. Obviously, not all 9 are at the same level in terms of importance or greatness. We talked about the 5th, but the 3rd obviously is incredibly famous. The 9th is one that you surely have heard, if not, almost as equally as famous as the 5th. But one thing about the 9th that I think a lot of people don't know is like the other, 3 movements of that symphony. Generally, everybody knows the Ode to Joy, the dun 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 dun. But that's actually in the 4th movement, right? So there's a lot to explore there. But it's also, I think, important to explore other forms of classical music, right? It's not always just a symphony. It's not always just an orchestra, right? I mean, there's just complete just piano music, right? There's the sonata form of like the violin sonata, where you just have a violin and a piano, or a cello sonata, etc. One of the most exciting forms that I really personally like is the concerto, where if it's like a violin concerto or a piano concerto or a cello concerto, you have like a soloist, just a single person who is like standing in front of the orchestra, sort of almost in like battling with the orchestra, sometimes playing along with it, but then going on these like virtuosic, soloing, and like it's really, really fun, because now you're getting into not just like a conductor, but you're also talking about the performer and their interpretation of the piece of music. So it's that stuff really gets me excited.
It's the guitar solo of the classical world.
Yeah. We should cover some of that eventually, maybe in the future.
All right, we'll do, in a few weeks, we'll do a concerto themed episode. We'll do Jerry Garcia versus...
there we go.
somebody.
All right, well, what do you think? We'd love to read your thoughts on the air. You can email us, popshieldpod@gmail.com. Next episode, as always, not sure. If you like the show, help us out by subscribing. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff is @PopShieldPod, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.